I want to talk to you about Iraq, Afghanistan, the role of Canada and the United States governments and our social movements, because that's what I do with my life now. I never hoped to do this. I was a civil rights activist. I was a student activist. Every time I try to do something about the malls in my backyard, LA City Council, state legislature, there always was another war. This may be familiar to you looking over the border, but by one school of thought, the United States is always at war somewhere. As Lyndon Johnson once said, you can't go to sleep without 100 million people making trouble somewhere. He did say that. Usually more poignant, destructive, visible wars occur at a rapidity that's breathtaking, about every 5 years. So I keep trying to come back to improving the quality of life in my own country, and I keep finding my government straying away from my country, claiming that my country is not safe without 800 military bases, several secret wars, and 2 or 3 big ones going on at the same time. I'm speaking here about Iraq, where we have 140,000, 160,000 U.S. troops. Afghanistan, where there's 60,000 Western troops, including Canadian. Of course, 30,000, 40,000 of them are U.S. troops. The coming war in Pakistan, which is already a kind of war, and if you read the American press and the British press, you see the drumbeat in the media has already begun, just as it did in 2002 about Iraq. The theory being that Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda Central Committee meet in the mountains around the Khyber Pass. They're protected by the Pashtun tribal groups. They're protected by the military of Pakistan and even by the democratically elected government of Pakistan. And that's the reason that we in the United States and Canada are soon going to be attacked. Unless we engage in a preemptive war, which is already underway with commandos, by bombing and destroying any targets imaginable in the famous centers of world revolution, South Waziristan and North Waziristan. So that's your job. In my time, the job was to stop the madness of the Cold War thermonuclear arms race. In this generation, you will be blighted, I guarantee it, slowly but surely, and sometimes traumatically, by the dangers in the world posed by the war on terror or the alleged war on terror. And whoever is the next president, I can guarantee you, while we may begin withdrawing troops from Iraq, we will not be withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, and we will be increasing those troops in Afghanistan and probably in Pakistan. These are only the visible wars. So the impact of that, according to Dr. Stiglitz and Bilmes at Harvard, is a $3 trillion war overall in a 20-year time frame, probably $10 billion so far from Canadians. A conflict which will take 5,000 or 10,000 American lives and leave 50,000 or 60,000 Americans wounded in ways that are so traumatic that they cost a lifetime of suffering and taxpayer expense. And 100 Canadians, 200 Canadians, on it will go until people in Canada, people in my country, find a way to resist and stop this alleged solution to the problem, which I think only makes the problem deeper. I'm not one on the left who thinks there's no problem. You know, there are some who actually believe that we in the United States attacked ourselves in order to invent 9/11, just as they believe that Roosevelt allowed the attack on Pearl Harbor. I'm not one of those people. I believe, though, that my family, my 8-year-old, are threatened every second of every day by provocative policies that can only lead to a cycle of provocation that will lead to unnecessary American and Canadian deaths and losses in dollars, losses in Canadian currency, losses in honor, and probably above all, losses in direction, because we will never have the resources to deal with the problems of global warming, environmental restoration, illiteracy, improving the college opportunities, providing schools for little kids, providing more health care, particularly for seniors, and so on. These are not costs that can be addressed by simply recruiting more people and printing more money. Now, in particular, I hope that in the coming days you will sign a protest. Maybe people who are signing at the door can sign a sheet of paper and send it to your immigration minister, interior minister, prime minister, representatives to say no to any deportation of these American war resistors who are here. This shouldn't even be a chore for us. This is not the 60s. There was a time when Canada and the Trudeau government welcomed, I don't know how many of you in this room are among them, but welcomed, was it 50,000 Americans, no? Yeah. Over the border. I came, I spoke to them. There was freedom in the air, there was tension. It really happened. Jimmy Carter then brought them back. It wasn't so long ago. Here we're talking about 25 to 50 or 75 people. You know what this is? This attempt at deportation against the will of the Canadian people, against the will of the Canadian Parliament. You know what it is? It's a favor by Stephen Harper to George Bush on his way out of office. It's really crass. It's dishonorable. To send a handful of young men back to the Pentagon's prisons because they were able to see that they were going to be shredded by an indifferent war machine if they went to Iraq or Afghanistan. They should be credited with having some foresight, and the matter should rest until we get a new president and we get the war over with. This is not a repeat of the 60s, as some Canadians I hear on the radio are always saying, these boys should have known. They were not forced into the draft. They chose to do this. I think you know the answer to that. We have an economic draft where young men that can't get health care, can't get jobs, can't get into college. They're surrounded by recruiters at the door of every high school and community college in the States. They're pounding on the door. They're making offers, go to Afghanistan, go to Iraq, go into the army, and make it sound like it's a tropical vacation. That you should a vacation in the desert. You should enjoy the benefits that you'll get from your time served over there. You'll see camels. You'll see pyramids. You'll make more money than you ever will in your miserable life, and on and on and on, and they don't stop. And the schools are forced to turn over the data and the phone numbers. They don't stop until they meet their quota and more go over into the meat grinder to become one of them, as John Kerry famously once said, the last to die in a lost cause, the last to die in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's to be stopped. So it's coming to a head in Canada, and I would hope that it can be stopped. But it's not the only dimension. The other thing that is noteworthy to me about Canada is the fight put up by many Canadians to speak out against the Central Intelligence Agency's rendition program, the case of Mr. Arar, the ability of Canada to weigh in against torture is not inconsequential. It is appreciated in my country. It is noticed in the Pentagon. It is noticed in the White House. And I have to tell you, and in case you have not figured this out already, that torture is not a random act of isolated, aggravated, frustrated, overwrought prison guards. You know, every disaster is always blamed on a few bad apples. I have to tell you that torture and abuse and the suspension of human rights, including the Geneva Convention, particularly Article 3, is an inevitable byproduct of a counterinsurgency strategy that depends on securing the population against the alleged insurgents. A lot of sweeps, a lot of knocking down doors, and a lot of holding people in detention camps without charges. If this sounds made up, how many of you remember the Phoenix program? The Phoenix program is an ill-named program in South Vietnam in which the CIA and USAID funded South Vietnamese police going into villages and identifying what they called the Viet Cong infrastructure, mayors, peasant leaders, doctors, nurses, teachers, you know, people who were running villages which were outside the control of the United States. And they summarily executed, killed tens of thousands of them and rounded up 10, 20, 30, 50,000 more in strategic hamlets, call it a concentration camp, whatever you like. The chief advisor on counterinsurgency to General David Petraeus in Iraq in 2004 wrote an article in a journal called Small Wars advocating a global Phoenix program. Based on Vietnam, he said the Phoenix program in Vietnam has a much maligned history. It was actually quite effective. It should be carried out globally. The experimental laboratories would be Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, but globally. He withdrew the phrase 3 years later after a number of us hammered at it, and he just renamed the program what its original name was in South Vietnam, the Village Rural Community Development Program or something like that. But it's the same word for word advocacy. So let me sum it up like this. You know about Abu Ghraib, you know about how many people have been targeted for death and executed in Iraq. It's huge numbers documented by the International Red Cross, by mainstream media, and so on. But today there are 100,000 people in Afghanistan and in Iraq, young men, who are held in detention camps, held indefinitely. They're rounded up, they're held, whether they're tortured or not. The point is that they lack any of the rights accorded to detainees under international human rights standards. They do not have lawyers. They do not have charges against them. They do not expect to see a judge. They will not get out unless they are subject to overcrowding and expelled. They are simply in a state of captivity, of preventive detention. It was called in apartheid South Africa. Anybody that has to preventively detain in camps without rights, a substantial portion of its younger generation has given up on its future or is afraid of its future. So to support international human rights groups or religious groups, go to stopfundingtorture.com and get informed. There are things that can be done from Canada, from Europe, from all over the world. I know the burden of the struggle is on ourselves in the States, but start to understand torture is a moral issue, yes, but what if it is actually an integral byproduct of the kind of warfare that we have chosen to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq, like Central America in the 1970s, South Vietnam in the 1960s, Algeria in the 1950s, Malaysia in the early 1950s, Kenya in the 1950s, on it goes. There's a whole literature out there. A lot of people in the peace movement say, study war no more. Maybe you've sung the song, I can appreciate that. But I think you have to study war more. I don't think we're educated enough in the doctrines of war and the execution of war to make us qualified to comment and criticize what is going on right before our eyes, although it's described in very neutral terms in the papers. If you know more about what we're doing, about counterinsurgency, you'll be more fortified in the struggle to undercut the funding for these secret prisons and detention camps. A lot of people ask me, well, how do you get any hope when you spend all your time thinking about torture? I ask myself, well, what kind of people don't think about torture? It's a terrible choice, but I would much rather be concentrating all the time on ending torture and suffering and thinking about it than not. I call not denial or ignorance. It's not a pretty picture. It doesn't have a happy ending. People are suffering every day. I know that. But it seems to me that if you put people pressure against the pillars of the policy will end. By that I mean your grassroots pressure shouldn't just be unfocused, but there are certain pillars that are necessary. Stephen Harper has some shaky pillars in that Canadian Parliament. Try to pull those parliamentary pillars and public opinion pillars away from his policies. You know, the votes to go on another year or another 3 years in Afghanistan are votes that separate majority from minority by less than 10. It's single digits. Imagine what you could do if you could get a parliamentary majority to just say no, enough. Secondly, it requires the pillar of the military. I know there are some people in Canada who are always trying to stir up a military spirit, thinking that's what's lacking in Canada. That to me is what's best about Canada. And to give the militarists a hard time is to put pressure on their ability to recruit and their ability to just suck up people to blindly go off fighting for flag and country. A third pillar is the budget. It costs a lot of money. $10 billion in Canadian money has gone just to Afghanistan. So go to the groups that are hurting in terms of the Canadian budget. May not be anti-war groups at all, may be senior citizens, healthcare workers, and broaden your coalition around the budget issues. The money for Afghanistan could go for domestic issues. That's the way I sort of view it. The more mobilization against the pillars of the policy, the better. It's something every single group, every single individual can do, and cumulatively, the pillars are worn down. That's the way that wars end.